On the night of May 31st, 1984, at exactly 11 p.m., the outer gate guard of a Virginia prison received a terrifying phone call. It was the internal security supervisor. His voice was trembling as he delivered an urgent order. There was a time bomb in Building 1. Open the gates immediately, take the van, and head to the building to evacuate the bomb. The instructions were extreme and direct. The guard was told a bomb was about to destroy the prison and everyone inside, and he was the only one who could get the explosive out in time. Under the weight of a catastrophic emergency, the guard made a choice to prioritize the immediate survival of the staff over the facility's rigid security protocols. The entrance consisted of 2 consecutive gates. Regulations absolutely prohibited opening both simultaneously under any circumstances. But the guard, convinced he was preventing a massacre, opened both gates. The van rushed into Building 1's courtyard, neutralizing the prison's critical defense. A 6-man bomb disposal team appeared, wearing heavy protective suits and helmets. They carefully loaded a device into the van, while one member continuously sprayed it with a fire extinguisher to keep the temperature down. They sped out of the prison through the wide-open gates as the guards watched them leave. The witnessing officers breathed a heavy sigh of relief, believing they had prevented a major disaster. What they didn't know was that the 6 men in those suits were not security officers or bomb experts. They were prisoners. These were 6 of the most dangerous murderers on death row. They didn't escape by breaking the walls of the fortress. They escaped by weaponizing the facility's own emergency protocols to walk right out the front door. This happened inside Mecklenburg Correctional Center. At the time, it was considered one of the most secure facilities in the United States, a fortress of concrete and coiled razor wire designed to be impenetrable. The escape occurred in Building 1's C block. This was a special section reserved exclusively for inmates sentenced to death and awaiting execution. When investigators finally regained control of Building 1, they found the unit in total disarray. They discovered the real prison guards locked away in the cells, tied up and wearing nothing but their underwear. The scale of the breach was historic. This was the first time multiple death row inmates had successfully escaped from a maximum security prison in the United States. The fact that the guards were found alive and restrained suggested this wasn't a spontaneous outburst of violence, but a meticulously planned tactical operation. The identities of the fugitives confirmed the state's worst fears. Among them were James and Linwood Briley, the leaders of a murder gang responsible for as many as 20 victims. The Brileys were known for extreme brutality. In one instance, they assaulted a woman in front of her husband and their 5-year-old child before murdering the entire family in cold blood. Then there was Earl Clanton. While out on a temporary release for a previous murder, he attacked a school librarian, stabbing her 8 times in the head before strangling her with her own belt. They were joined by Lem Tuggle, who murdered 2 elderly women, and Derek Peterson, who killed a store manager after stealing $6,000. The final escapee was Willie Jones. He murdered an elderly couple in their home, forcing the wife to pray to God before executing her and burning the house to the ground. These 6 men were now free. They were hardened killers with no remorse, and because they were already facing death sentences, they had no reason to hesitate before killing again. A massive manhunt began immediately. Local police, state investigators, and the National Guard established roadblocks across the state, creating a grid of checkpoints on every major highway. Helicopters searched from the air, while K-9 teams combed through miles of dense forest and surrounding brush, looking for any sign of movement. While the search continued outside, forensics teams began dismantling the empty death row cells, documenting every item left behind to determine how the inmates had prepared for the breach. They discovered an arsenal of sharpened homemade knives hidden throughout the block. One weapon had been concealed inside the hollowed-out leg of a wooden table. The inmates had spent months manufacturing these shanks in secret. The discovery shifted the nature of the pursuit. Law enforcement was now hunting 6 men who were both mobile and lethally armed. It remains a startling paradox. A multi-million-dollar facility designed to withstand a riot was defeated by a few sets of stolen clothes and a fake bomb. Investigators were left with impossible logistical questions. How did inmates, under 24-hour surveillance, manage to coordinate the initial authoritative phone call to the gate guard? Where did they find the materials to build convincing bomb disposal suits and a smoking device right under the noses of their captors? As night fell, the terror of the situation grew. 6 of the state's most prolific killers were roaming free, while the authorities were still trying to understand how they had been fooled. The Mecklenburg escape stands as a reminder that the greatest vulnerability in any security system isn't the physical barrier, but the human mind. The execution phase of the plan began in the prison yard. It was a scheduled outdoor recreation period, with inmates playing basketball under the supervision of 5 correctional officers. Inmate Willie Turner and another prisoner approached one of the guards. Turner claimed he had injured his knee, while the other requested permission to use the restroom before returning to the cell block. This diagram illustrates the facility's strict security protocol. No inmate was allowed to return inside alone. Either the entire group returned. 2 officers were required to escort the individual. Because of a lapse in discipline, 2 of the 5 officers agreed to escort the pair inside. This left the remaining prisoners under the watch of only 3 guards. By drawing these 2 officers away, the inmates reduced the number of eyes on the yard. They had successfully created the blind spots needed to coordinate their next movements without attracting attention. When recreation ended, the prisoners returned to the building. At the cell block entrance, a 4th guard was stationed at the electronic control panel. However, the officers failed to perform a basic head count. Suddenly, the inmates staged a disturbance, shouting and pushing one another. This commotion drew the collective attention of all 4 guards toward the group. At that moment, Earl Clanton slipped into a restroom reserved for prison staff. He locked the door from the inside and held it shut. When the inmates were returned to their cells, the guards didn't realize one man was missing. Later, a guard tried to use the restroom but found the door wouldn't budge. When he reported it, the control officer simply told him to use another one, ignoring the protocol to call maintenance for a jammed door. Building 1 was split into 3 sections. Section C was divided into 2 housing areas, separated by this glass control room where the supervising officer sat. By skipping the head count and dismissing the locked door, the guards allowed a hidden staging ground to exist directly adjacent to the facility's central monitoring station. One inmate began tapping on the glass to get the officer's attention. Holding a book, he asked if the guard would deliver it to James Briley in the opposite housing area. The officer agreed and stepped out of the control room. He pulled the door shut behind him, but failed to lock it completely. In the weeks leading up to the break, the inmates had monitored this specific guard's routine. They had noted that he frequently relied on the weight of the heavy door to latch itself, rather than verifying the deadbolt was engaged. As the guard handed over the book, Briley shouted the signal, "Thanks for the book." Clanton burst from the restroom, raced into the unlocked control room, and pressed the buttons that opened every cell door in the section. Inmates rushed out with homemade knives. They restrained the 4 guards and immediately stripped them of their uniforms and identification. The takeover proved that a physical barrier is only as secure as the habits of the person operating it. Within minutes, the inmates were wearing the authority they had just overthrown. The inmates now controlled Section C, but they hit a barrier. The guards they had captured didn't have the clearance levels required to open the prison's main exterior gates. At knife point, they forced a guard to call the prison supervisor. They reported a violent fight and a serious injury to lure a lieutenant to the scene. Instead of the lieutenant, a duty officer arrived first. Seeing what he thought was a fellow guard sitting in the control room, he entered the area without hesitation. He was immediately ambushed, and his equipment was seized. They continued summoning staff one by one. When 2 prisoners attempted to assault a captured nurse, the mastermind, Willie Turner, intervened. He forced them back, prioritizing operational discipline over impulsive behavior to keep the plan from collapsing. The inmates had turned the prison's chain of command against itself. By dressing as guards, they weaponized the staff's instinctive trust in the uniform. Communication with Section C had gone silent, and the duty officer had not reported back. This sudden radio silence eventually drew the attention of the supervising lieutenant. He decided to investigate the silence personally. Using his personal key, he entered through a rear staircase door reserved for senior staff. The moment the automatic door clicked shut behind him, he was ambushed. He was trapped in a stairwell with men who had spent the last hour methodically dismantling the facility's security. Capturing the lieutenant provided the inmates with the one thing the previous guards lacked: the authority to open any door in the prison. the inmates marched the lieutenant at knife point toward the main entrance of Building 1. Behind a reinforced glass booth sat a female officer, controlling the building's final exit. This door was physically impossible to bypass from the outside. It required a manual trigger from inside the control booth. The inmates forced the lieutenant to use the intercom. He told the officer that a replacement was arriving to relieve her from her shift. Even though the request came at an unusual time, she didn't question the voice of her direct superior. She opened the door, allowing the disguised inmates to walk in and take control of the building's entire security panel. The final interior barrier was breached because the officer followed the chain of command rather than her own situational awareness. Only 2 massive exterior gates remained. To clear them, the inmates forced the lieutenant to call the gate officer and order both gates open simultaneously. The lieutenant told the gate officer a live time bomb was found in the building and that a transport van needed to move through the gates immediately. The gate officer didn't demand proof because the scenario felt familiar. 2 months earlier, the prison had undergone a massive search following a real bomb threat. To him, the panic in the building appeared to be a recurrence of an event he had already lived through. The inmates wrapped a television in a blanket to look like an explosive device. They donned heavy riot helmets and protective gear from the storage room, completely concealing their identities. As they carried the bomb to the van, they shouted for the gate officer to stay back. One inmate sprayed a fire extinguisher over the stretcher, using the billowing white smoke to increase the sense of panic. Terrified by the threat of an explosion, the officer backed away. All 6 inmates climbed into the van and drove out of the prison. By exploiting behavioral flaws and utilizing the prison's own hierarchy, these men bypassed every physical security measure in the facility without firing a single shot. Late at night, 6 death row inmates drove a marked prison van along a public highway. When they passed a parked police cruiser, the men waved at the officer. Assuming this was a routine transport, the officer waved back. This timeline comparison shows how the inmates utilized their head start. The van crossed the state line into North Carolina within the first hour of the escape, well before the Virginia alert bulletins reached neighboring law enforcement agencies. Upon reaching the rural town of Winton, North Carolina, the group drove the van into dense woods and abandoned it. To complicate the search, they immediately split into 2 separate groups. The first group moved through the residential outskirts and found ordinary clothes hanging on a clothesline outside a house. They stole the garments and discarded their high-visibility correctional uniforms. By utilizing the delay in jurisdictional communication and changing their physical appearance, the fugitives managed to distance themselves from the prison before a perimeter could be established. 3 hours after the breakout, a North Carolina patrol found the empty van hidden in the brush. Because the vehicle was 50 kilometers outside the original search zone, the FBI officially took control of the investigation. At 5 o'clock that morning, a Winton resident reported their blue pickup truck stolen from their driveway. The truck's fuel tank was full, significantly expanding the potential search area for the FBI. Residents of Winton woke up to roadblocks and helicopters. Armies of officers and police dogs began searching every corner of the town, while state police began searching civilian vehicles at major intersections. Local gun stores sold out of ammunition as families barricaded themselves inside their homes. Paranoia grew so intense that many residents refused to open their doors, even for uniformed police officers, fearing the inmates were using disguises. The presence of the escapees turned a logistical search into a community crisis, as the uncertainty of their location paralyzed daily life in Winton. The first break in the case occurred 19 hours after the escape. Earl Clanton and Derek Peterson walked into a public laundromat in Winton in the middle of the afternoon. They had changed their clothes and were looking for a quiet place to eat. A patrol car happened to pass the building. The driver was the leader of the prison's emergency response team, who recognized the specific correctional jacket Clanton was still wearing, despite his change of clothes. Officers entered the building with weapons drawn and ordered both men to the wall. The 2 inmates surrendered without a struggle. While Clanton and Peterson had successfully navigated the initial roadblocks, their failure to discard a single piece of prison-issued clothing led to their identification. The search for the remaining 4 fugitives moved hundreds of miles north to Vermont. Inmates Lem Tuggle and Willie Jones had traveled toward Canada but were running out of fuel and money. Tuggle robbed a small store at knife point, taking $80. The owner recorded the license plate number of his vehicle, and police captured Tuggle after a short pursuit. The following day, Willie Jones called emergency services to surrender. He explained to investigators that he was starving and could no longer tolerate the insects and the exposure of hiding in the woods. Jones surrendered only a few kilometers from the Canadian border. He traveled nearly 1,000 kilometers, only to stop within sight of the crossing. The lack of resources and the physical toll of the journey ended the northern escape before the fugitives could cross the border. The FBI focused its remaining efforts on James and Linwood Briley. The search intensified after the brothers opened fire on police officers during a vehicle theft attempt in Portsmouth, Virginia. The FBI analyzed the brothers' telephone records and identified a pattern of communication. This network graph shows how a series of calls led investigators to monitor the home of the brothers' uncle. Surveillance teams followed the uncle to an auto body repair shop. They suspected the Brileys were hiding inside the industrial building. After tracing a telephone call from the shop, agents sent an undercover informant inside. He positively identified James Briley working on a vehicle. On June 19, 1984, FBI and police vehicles converged on the shop from every direction. Officers stormed the building, and both brothers surrendered. The use of intelligence gathering and targeted surveillance located the brothers 19 days after the initial breakout. With the capture of the Briley brothers, all 6 fugitives were back in custody. The state of Virginia ordered the temporary closure of the Mecklenburg facility and introduced new security measures. Several officials and guards were dismissed for negligence that allowed the escape to happen. The state eventually carried out the death sentences for all 6 men. One by one, the inmates involved in the escape were executed in the years that followed. The 6 men successfully bypassed the physical barriers of the prison, but the 19-day search concluded with every individual returned to the system they had attempted to leave.